Ça me fait de la peine de parler en anglais, en fait, parce que tout le travail de Slavs and Tatars est une sorte de pression sur contre l'hégémonie anglaise, mais bon. Good evening. No, no, but I think that's very 19th century, no? A little bit, but if we speak in French. But a bit great game of us to speak of our idioms. Anyway, I will just quickly introduce what we're doing here and why we're here. Slavs and Tatars, as Kati mentioned, is a collective devoted to an area east of the former Berlin Wall and the Great Wall of China, namely Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe. The reason why we're interested in this particular region of the world is that it happens to fall through the cracks, if you will, of the public imagination of historiography, 20th century historiography, I would say, in the sense that I like to say that it misses all the Venn diagrams, you know? And people like to put Venn diagrams today on memes. So if you put all the Venn diagrams together, Central Asia is a little bit, it misses all the diagrams because it's largely Muslim, but it's not the Middle East. It's largely Russophone, but not by its own choice, by colonization. It's largely in Asia, but never under Chinese rule, except for Xinjiang and the Uyghurs. And it's largely Turkic speaking, but never under the Ottoman Empire, but under the Russian Empire. So it's a mismatch of all sort of language versus ethnicities, and that's what makes it interesting for us. This year we've been invited to curate the opening section of the fair, which is devoted to Central Asian artists and their work on textile. And we've imagined Central Asia in an expansive, capacious sense, in the sense that it's not just Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and what did I miss? Tajikistan. It's also Afghanistan, and even the more polemic I would say it's even Iran, because Iran is of course equally a Central Asian country as it is a Middle Eastern country, in linguistically as well as spiritually or religiously. I'm thrilled to be joined by Catherine David, who's as one of the curators whose work for the first time for us, 20 years before Slavs and Tatars was founded, was the first kind of insight or possibility for us to imagine art as functioning beyond a formal. I mean, we were young, but the documenta was very informative, and her work subsequently has been very informative, especially the show she did at is it Musée d'Art Moderne on Iran and Revolution, de la Ville de Paris, which is very important. Unedited history, I think it was called in 2000. Yes. So I pass the mic to you.
So we won't speak about Iran. I think due to age, and I have the privilege of having known your work from close to the very beginning, and I have to say that I always found very interesting and intelligent, you know, the focus, especially at the time when you began to work, which was really to build up an experimental space, research, writing, publications, also very inventive exhibition devices, temporary, in many, many different circumstances. And with the passing of time, we see that this focus and this Eurasian issue is more and more interesting as a paradigm, in a way. If you look at the archaeological research, all the emphasis and all the knowledge which has been built around the Sogdians in the last 50 years, when you see many of the archaeological discoveries in China, and pushing up to reconsider a little bit the political and social organizations. I think it's absolutely, it was very, very, very strong intuition. And I didn't see the exhibition yet, because this is the rule of the game, you know, we discovered things are done very, very fast, last moment. But I know about the work, and I know that at least the focus you decided for here is through the history of textile, which is of course a very interesting paradigm for the region, because it's a practice, it's a material, it's an history which is really helping to understand culture, to understand exchanges, to understand inventions, cultural inventions, through a practice which is very different from the one which has been mythified by the modernist thinking. And it's really helping us to go back to different moments. And from my perspective, because I'm not an anthropologist, I'm not a specialized of Eurasia. Even so, I know quite well a few countries or few parts, because those of you better speak in terms of geocultural spaces or parts of Eurasia than countries in the 19th century state of the world. And it's a very important way for, again, rediscussing the modern moment, how things organized, how it articulated, depending on very different long-term cultures, depending on the language. You spoke about the many different language, but you know what it created. And there is also one element when you spoke about Iran, I think it was very unnecessary, because you know you had for a long time what is called the Persianate, and the Persianate is more than Iran. It's really like a civilizational issue. So I think for all these reasons, it's quite interesting to bring, especially in this moment, a corpus which is inviting to complexities, which is inviting to build complex paradigms and not to keep on working with the small boxes and labels and cliches. And of course it's difficult. Sometimes it's not really easy in order to enter in dialogues with certain audiences, but I think it's more than ever very necessary.
I mean, one of the you know, when we started Slavs and Tatars in 2006, I remember commenting to my partner that our region could not become more remote than it was at the time in 2006. That is, it can only become more and more relevant. Because of course it's important to understand that our region is only remote today in the past 100 years. I would argue that Central Asia and the region, Eurasia, has been at the center of history for the most of the past 2,000 years, whether it was the Silk Road, the Great Game, the Islamic Renaissance of the 12th century, where we talked about Al-Biruni, Al-Khwarizm, you know, it's always been very important, but it's fallen into kind of an obscure situation for most of the world, and largely because of, and I find this very telling, is that even in the Muslim world, it's one thing for Westerners not to know what's happening in Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan. I often joke that people in the West know more about what's happening on Star Trek than they know what's happening in Central Asia, you know? So it's like, that's how remote it is, unfortunately. And I'm not a fan of Star Trek, so it's not a compliment. But the problem is that even the Muslim world doesn't consider Central Asia and the Caucasus as part of itself. So when the Muslim world defines itself, it defines itself as MENASA. What does MENASA stand for? Middle East, North Africa, South Asia. It's actually a Cold War acronym. And for some reason, they think that, you know, Uzbeks and Azerbaijanis and Kyrgyz are no longer Muslim because they drink vodka and they were communized, and that's finished. And it's of course very myopic, but also it doesn't understand that again, the richness of the traditions of this region is actually, in some ways, because it's so syncretic, that they have so many Hinduistic, Buddhistic, because it was the edge of the Muslim world. So they've incorporated sort of pantheistic Tanri, you know, the famous religion of, let's say, Genghis Khan's period, the Great Sky. These are things that have been incorporated into Islamic practice there. And I would argue that actually today, the most progressive Islam is actually happening in the parts of the world that we think are not Muslim, namely Central Asia, Indonesia, the kind of places that a traditionalist would say this is actually blasphemy. And a good example of this is when we talk about modernization. We did a book in 2012 on the occasion of an exhibition at the Secession in Vienna, and the book was called "Not Moscow, Not Mecca." It was taking this Stalinist idea that in the 50s Stalin told the Muslims of Central Asia, look to Moscow, don't look to Mecca. So basically pray to communism, don't pray to Islam. And what we realize is that actually because Central Asia missed out, so today when we hear the news, especially what's happening in the Middle East, we hear a lot about talks about how Islam needs to reform, Islam has missed its modern moment, etc., etc. Actually, it's the opposite, is that modernity has brought the radicalization of Islam that we see in the rest of the world, because before modernity, places like Uzbekistan, Islam was an oral tradition. So nobody could give a fatwa and say this is what should happen. An oral tradition which was passed by family to family. So Uzbekistan, for example, missed out on modernity because printing came around the late 19th, early 20th century. And of course, by the time it arrived to Central Asia, it was communist, so they couldn't print books about Islam, but also about Christianity and Judaism. So they missed the whole kind of the modernity of faith, of religion. And because they've missed that, they've maintained this ritualistic oral tradition. So the Islam that's still happening in Central Asia is somehow current and relevant because it's actually not modern in some sense, and as opposed to the kind of public perception, which is that we need to modernize religions. It's actually, which is leading, I would argue, to more kind of an unnecessary sort of violence of religion in some sense.
Yeah, and I think there is also this moment in when you speak about the modern, even more close to classical dynamics, when you see the coming of Stalinism in Russia, and you see a big move of collections and artists to Uzbekistan, and it's something which was not very well documented in the exhibition in IMA for different reasons probably, but it was very difficult to understand why it happened, how it happened, and what the museum is now. I don't remember the name of the city. No, because it was not very clear what happened, unfortunately, to the museum now. But it's also really part of the whole history, and I think now it could be very interesting to rethink the whole avant-garde aventure and all this moment, including this chapter, because it's not the end, it's a kind of other development, other possibilities, and of course a kind of congelation at the end. But back to what you were saying, I think it's really, again, inviting to complexities, because all what you said on the, and that of course the modernization is also coming with radicalization and with a kind of a fixation of certain codes, but even now, very few people, of course you had a few articles in Le Monde and many more in specialized magazines or reviews, but you have not so many discussions at the moment or knowledge about the fact that you have even a competition between, and they are not of course progressive countries, but in the reform of Islam between Saudi and Indonesia, which is because what you say absolutely and true, and we could add today that it's very often I have to remind to many people that the greatest number of Muslim people, whether they are practicing Indonesian, they are not Arabs at all. So again, through very, very specific articulations, you can really come back to key issues of the moment, bringing back a certain level of knowledge and thinking. Back to what you were saying, I thought that you would mention, and you didn't, so I will, because I think it's a very, very speaking project, the one you did republishing Mullah Nasreddin publication, which is from Azerbaijan, which is Tiflis, and which was published in the early 20th century, and which is an amazing, it's between the comics, the bande dessinée, which circulated through all the region, and this you could do with, I would say, many other, we have many other examples of this very, very unexpected or not known enough circulations of images, discourses, which really contributed to, so also that about the critical thinking, the critical ways of expressing itself in this space is quite interesting. So maybe I don't know if you want to elaborate on other things.
Yeah, we translated in 2011 this satirical journal called Mullah Nasreddin. It was published between 1906 and 1930, first in Baku, first in Tbilisi, briefly in Tabriz, and then Baku. It was an Azerbaijani journal. It's arguably the most important periodical of the Muslim world of the 20th century, because it was read from Marrakesh to India, largely because it was visual. And of course, most people who were reading it were not literate, so that's why an Egyptian could read it as well as an Indian. What was interesting about this was, I say that often just to tease my collective members, that in 200-300 years, the only thing that people remember of Slavs and Tatars might be this book, because and it shows actually why we're focused on this region, is that how come the most important periodical of the 20th century Muslim world was not translated into English until we did it in 2011. It's not because we found it in some corner of a dusty place in a library in Baku. It's because people don't go to the region, and if they go for oil, or they go for Eurovision, or they go for they don't go for intellectual, cultural reasons, unfortunately. And so for me, it's shocking that this, if again, we believe the nonsense which passes as wisdom today, that somehow the West and Islam are in some kind of conflict, then you would imagine that all the policy thinkers, scholars would have translated this this magazine a long time ago, 50 years ago. And this magazine was very feminist also, so it would really put women's rights on a kind of very forefront of its issues. Also, it was very important for Azeri national identity. It was the first magazine to publish Azeri as opposed to in Azeri language, because until then, Azeri was considered a dialect. So people would publish in Azerbaijan either in Russian or in Istanbul Turkish. And it was it was foundational. It was basically in the same line of L'assiette au beurre or Simplicissimus, or these kind of, that time of the early 20th century was a kind of a peak moment of satirical publications in Germany, in France, Punch and Judy in the UK. And actually, most of the illustrations were done by Germans in the Caucasus, actually. So they were these German enclaves of people who had been brought by Catherine the Great to the Russian Empire to work in the Russian Empire, and they actually were the illustrators. And so, this is a kind of Molla Nasruddin has become also the name Molla Nasruddin he's based on a kind of a wise man fool of our region. He's a 12th century figure that you often see riding backwards on his donkey, and he's the equivalent in our culture. So everywhere there were Muslims, historically, from the Balkans to China, all the way down to the Sahara, there's a version of Nasruddin. So the Iranians call him Molla Nasruddin, the Turks call him Khoja, the Arabs call him Joha, the Chinese call him Afanti, from Effendi, the Turkish word. And anyway, he's a really great figure because he asks very stupid questions to smart subject matter. And by asking these stupid questions, a typical Nasruddin story is somebody's yelling from one side of the river, Molla Nasruddin, how do I get to the other side of the river? And Nasruddin says, you are on the other side of the river. So like very, very first degree, but behind this first degree, there's a lot of questions of perception, relativism, etc. So it functions as a kind of La Fontaine's fables, Brothers Grimm in our cultures. And this role of humor is very important because for our practice, as Catherine mentioned, is because, coming back to what I said earlier, because our region is so remote to most of the world, as artists, we are very aware that most of our audience doesn't care about our region. So what does that mean as artists is that we have to consider the mediation of the artwork in the conception of the artwork. It doesn't mean that we're making works to please an audience, but it means that we have to meet our audience halfway through spaces of hospitality, through humor. I can't turn my back to the audience and say, look, if you're not interested in syncretism in Central Asia, then bugger off. I don't have that luxury because I'm not dealing with subject matter that everybody's thinking about. I'm not dealing with artificial intelligence. I'm not dealing with questions of ecology. I'm not dealing with things that are already on people's minds. So we have to kind of find a way to get them interested in that topic. And Nasruddin is a very interesting way to do that because he uses this seemingly sort of foolish wisdom, right? For young people in the room, I guess I like to describe Nasruddin as a kind of proto-Ali G or Borat, like 12th century Ali G in some sense. And by stupid questions, there's things that are revealed.
But I think I agree, but I would say that it's not completely true that people are not interested to Eurasia, but very often very superficially or for bad reasons. Le Grand Jeu, the Great Game, the Silk Road, even if this is also confusion because the Silk Road is not going through all, and it's anyway. But what I find so that's true that people that are not necessarily deeply interested or knowledgeable, and then we can maybe enter in one aspect of your work I always found very, very interesting and singular, because it's that you have so many now people researching and it's but what I always found very, very strong is the way you formalize. So the way you are able to pass a certain level of hermeneutics through forms and through a very, very deep knowledge, and especially in the region, of course, the textile is very strong, a very strong expression, but also the graphism, that's very, very strong graphic expressions, and the way through a very deep knowledge and understanding of these different practices, the history, the different moments, how you are able to morph it into forms and sometimes temporary formal devices, or I don't like the word installation, because installation, it's like a white cube, and it's like it's so extensive that at the end of the day doesn't mean anything. So I would say formal design and or space design for temporary moment. And through that, you can really, again, pass a certain level of understanding. So on a very sensitive, but also a very articulated way. And this is very, very special. And on this level, you see that it's very often attractive and even sometimes very seductive due to the colors, the complexity of the forms. But at the same time, when you begin to look carefully to the space or to the works, you can begin to build up a narrative or a situation. I would prefer a situation. You can begin to, even so it's, you can pass through a narrative, but you are building up situations, which I find extremely, because it's not illustrative, it's not about playing as if you were an anthropologist. It's a very, very precise way of intervening at a certain moment. And again, it can be in the space, it can be publication, and I think this is very, very close to unique in the avalanche or sea of research statements, and I think it's for me what makes the difference.
I mean, thank you. I think that you know, we have three things that we do, activities. One is exhibition making, one is books, as you can see, like this one, and you can see in the reading room upstairs at the main hall, and the third is lectures. And I often say that our books and our lectures articulate things. As I'm talking today, you'll never find anything in our books about. We'll never talk about the people that art world people talk about. You'll never see Rancière, you'll never see Deleuze. We never refer to any of these people, not because we don't read them, but because we don't feel that it's welcoming to talk about figures, unless it's figures. So when I read a book, I want to read about figures I've never heard about. I don't want to read about figures I've heard about. So I'm interested in bibliographies that are expansive and tentacular, not that are sort of refining in some sense. But if I'm articulating things through books and through lectures, then the role, of course, of the artwork, that's the hardest part, is what does it do? And the best way I can put it is that I think that actually the role of art is to disarticulate. And disarticulation is a difficult concept because it doesn't mean to stay silent. It means to actually, in my opinion, it means almost to undo the narrative that you've just done in the book. Because and I guess the best analogy is, for me, is like since we're talking about textiles, is you stitch a sweater, you embroider a sweater, there's always a loose thread. The art has to undo the sweater that you just, the narrative that you just concocted. And to do that, it's very difficult because it cannot be, as you said, illustrative, right? And that's also, I mean, you talked about research practices. I remember, I think Walid Rad recently said somewhere that today's research-based artists are like today's RBAs or yesterday's YBAs, is that everybody's a research-based artist, right? Everybody does research. And he was, of course, taking issue with that because, like Walid, we don't call research just going to a site for 2 weeks and meeting people. We call research reading several years of books, working with scholars. And then the question becomes, what do you do with that research? And you never can present, I believe you can never present the research as an artist in an exhibition space. I find that's a complete sort of faux pas because, first of all, it's disrespectful to your audience. If your audience wants to read, they should be getting it as a PDF or a book in their home. Nobody wants to stand and read. That's the biggest mistake architects make, right? Because they just make walls to read things. Nobody wants to stand and read. It's the least sensual thing in the world. But also, as an artist, I think it's lazy to present research because I believe, again, it's not our role as artists to present research. That's the scholar's role. Our role is to break the research in some ways, is to disrespect the research. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. I don't know how one approaches that, but...
I prefer that you said that than me. It makes it much easier for me. But you know what you describe, it's what I called for many years neither nor. So a certain kind of work, it's neither a serious research, an anthropologist or very, very specialized and knowledgeable and locally based journalist, as you have less and less, is able to do. And it's not either a satisfactory, meaningful, formal proposal. And I think it's really like, bringing a lot of, we are a little bit tied. And again, I think that in your work, what is really interesting is this formal work. And it's not at all, it's never monumental, it's never over-assertive. You know, you have always a kind of flexibility in the way you can decodify and look at. This is one thing. But this said, so that this said, now I have to come back to what I wanted to say. What is also very, very interesting, you know, is in what you were saying, is that it brings us back to the unfinished history of the modern. And it seems to me that the last, let's say, 20 to 30 years, most of the serious people, whether they were art historians, I think it had to do with the what I would call more and more attention paid to the clandestine and or less known, forgotten part of the modern. And of course, this is even more visible, and it's for obvious reasons, in the non-Euro-American geospaces of the world. But when you work carefully on one of these author, artist, or situation, it brings you back to your own circumstances, and it's also an element you can see in the way the modern history is still, especially modern art history, is still narrated with so many. Again, it's not just about missing artists, but artists, situations, paradigms, and I think this is really also one of the very, very interesting for me cultural, aesthetical, and also political aspect of your work. But that was a big P, not.
No, it's. I mean, today's the mot du jour, of course, is decolonializing, especially in our region, right? Everybody's talking about decolonizing Russia, decolonizing Central Asia, Eurasia, etc. We've never used this term, again, for similar reasons as I mentioned before about other French theorists. It's not because we're against decolonization. Obviously, we embrace those efforts, but I think that the risk is that you know, we've never, for example, if you look at our work, we've never in 15 years dealt with Russia. It's not because we're anti-Russian, not at all. I speak Russian. I spent many years in Moscow and St. Petersburg. It's because we're interested in doing, as you mentioned, things that people are not doing. There's been enough interest in Russia for the past 100 years, so we were always interested in the peripheries of the Russian-speaking world. But you can, and so instead of, what I would like to say is that in some ways, to your point of sort of different audiences, is that what I noticed is I tried to understand why did museums come very early to us. When we started Slavs and Tatars, we only wanted to publish. We were happy to publish a couple books a year, and within 5 years we had major shows at the MoMA, at the Kunsthaus Zurich, etc. And I tried to think about why did that happen in terms of what was the sociocultural circumstances that allowed for that to happen, right? And I think that one of the reasons was that, and now museums are saying that to us explicitly, what they didn't say, what they were implicitly doing before, which is that as museums are held to be more and more accountable to the publics, trying to bring in other publics that they don't normally target, is that now museums come to us and say, look, we're in Hanover, we would like to bring in the non-German audience of Hanover, the Turkish-speaking audience, the Russian-speaking audience, and you can help us do that. They never said that before, but now they say it. And I think the reason why they've mentioned that, they've understood that, is that if there's a decolonization happening today, which again, I don't like this term, if there's a decentering, it's not happening at the level of the knowledge as much as happening at the level of the audience. And what I mean by that is that when a Russian or when an Armenian dentist comes into the Kunsthalle in Hanover, he immediately understands that this is a space for him or her in a way that he doesn't feel that in normal art spaces. Because for better or for worse, it's a complex issue, but most of contemporary art spaces are built on the premise of a general understanding of Western art history, a kind of bourgeoisification of the citizen understanding the role of art history. And what we're doing is never talking about art history, Western art history. We're talking about our region in a way that immediately makes the people from our region feel comfortable, so that they are the privileged audience. And the Western audience is not that we're dismissing them, but we're not targeting them per se, let's say. They're not privileged in the way that most contemporary art spaces privilege the kind of the vécu and the accumulated savoir of or knowledge base of a let's say a Western educated public interested in art. So when they see an iron machine in the space in Hanover, they say, okay, well, this is not necessarily a foreign space. And then through these different modalities, we can talk about political issues that, again, there's a kind of, I think there's a, you said this neither nor, which I like the way you articulate it, is I would say that a lot of art that deals with politics does it in a way which is obvious. It's clear from 100 meters away, it's political art. It's lit in a certain way. It's somber. It's serious. And we've been taken to task by people, a lot of people in the art world, weirdly enough, all around the Benelux area. I don't know why they're focused there, that say that, Slavs and Tatars does not have the right to talk about serious subject matter in a way that you talk about it, meaning that it's colorful. Why is it funny? You cannot be, and I think, of course, that's the whole point, is how can we be critical and at the same time do it in a festive way? Because being critical and showing in a critical way, that's easy. Being festive and being silly and fun, that's also easy. The difficulty is to bring them together. And again, that doesn't always happen successfully, but when it does, I think that's the sweet spot as an artist, I think, in some ways.
But, also in what you say, in the practice, the way you are organizing your work and after the circulation of the work, I think there's also a point I find very interesting, is that most of your strategies are absolutely contributing to de-essentializing situations. And I think this is what you were saying, I'm really tired of people asking me, you should be interesting for this group or this group or this group. So we are in a situation where on one hand, we never heard so much about freedom, and everybody wants to be restricted to one aspect of not even his subjectivity. So I think it's really an issue. The same, I thought you would say that some people discussed your work or your project because you are not from the region, which is happening these days, which I find terrible, absolutely terrible. And it reminds me a long discussion I had in Tehran with a mullah, but knowledgeable one, very an Omsa. And he was telling me, or a Shi'ism won't be so articulated, so well-known, so organized without Louis Massignon, Louis Massignon au Corbin, and they are very, very respectful. And, so it's really and it contributed to another reading of the early texts and so on. So I think this idea that also Segalen is the colonial artist. Now, what is this? I think Victor Segalen, as Venceslau de Moraes, the wonderful, call him the Portuguese Segalen. These people are absolutely a part of a modern circulation of text, of ideas, and I think it's absolutely reductive and absolutely not contributing to emancipation. I think that many of the people who are just tiring us with history or identity and this and that, they never really understood Derrida. And before, identity, it's not a package. It's not something you put under your arm and you have it and you save it forever. It has to do with processes of identification, which is very different. And now we could discuss if, at the end of the day, maybe what is really very questionable and probably a very unbalanced, for not saying unjust, process is that I have the feeling that the diversity, the complexity of the subjectivation process is more pleasurable, more depending on where you are on the social and economical échelle.
I mean, I think that's something that we from the very beginning, we kind of, I don't know what the word is, on a revendiqué dès le début, this idea that Slavs and Tatars is actually based on things we do not know. So from the beginning, we never situated ourselves as experts on the region. We said, we do not know about this particular region. We are not from this region. I'm not Tatar. I'm not Slav. But through certain linguistic accesses, Russian and Persian, first of all, we never do research without the first or second and third language of the region, which often is Russian and Persian, as a Persianate world, as you mentioned. But also it's important because I think that we often go back to, like any collective, is that, I mean, to be honest, I think the best work we've done is our name. I think Slavs and Tatars is, if I may say so, I think it's a genius name. And the reason why, I'll explain it, is that Tatar is an umbrella racist term which the first European explorers used for anybody who was brown from the region whom they didn't understand. So the first explorers in the 17th, whatever, from Marco Polo to the 18th, 19th century, they would say, oh, I know who Arabs are, I know who Persians are, I know who Turks are, and then I know the Christians, I know the Armenians and the Georgians. Everybody else, they didn't know what they are. Dagestani, Uzbek, they just called them all Tatar. So it's actually a racist term. And yet, it's a term which of course exists factually. There are Tatars, right? There are Tatars in Kazan. And then there's another Tatars in Krim. So imagine a term like barbarians actually being real barbarians somewhere that say we are actually barbarians. And then to make it more complex, there's two types of Tatars that both use the ethnonym Tatar from Kazan and from Crimea, that are not related to each other. So to make it more complex, it's two different ethnic groups who are using the same term just to make it more confusing. So it's, even in the name, you see this kind of unraveling of something really simple. Of course, also the name was, we started in 2006. The idea was to have a kind of, it was a satire on this. You remember in 2006, 2 years after the 10 new European member states entered, everybody in France was talking about the Polish plumber taking the jobs. I mean, just think about how naive, how good those times were. Our concerns were about Polish people coming and taking the jobs of plumbing in France. That was the concern of 2006, and look where we are today. We should have appreciated that, right? We should have thought that's the best thing that could happen to France, is that Polish people would come and take all the plumbing jobs, you know? It's obviously quite problematic, but it shows to what extent the world has changed, and which means also we as a collective have to adjust to that changing reality, because we founded the collective in a response to the world 2006, and the world today is a very different one, which is why we're doing things like the curating, which is why we've kind of institutionalized over the past 3 or 4 years. We've launched a pickle bar. We've kind of a Slavic aperitivo bar. We have a mentorship and residency program for young professionals from our region. We've had over 30 people from Belarus, from Kazakhstan, Armenia, because I think there's a responsibility also that comes with being an artist, that it's no longer, you know, Slavs and Tatars was never a collective, actually. It was a platform. And it was important to reclaim the platform. It's not about who's behind the collective. It's not a rock group. It doesn't matter who's behind it. What matters is the work being done, and it doesn't matter who does it. So the books can be published by others. Now we have a pickle bar that we present the work of people from our region that we're working with language performers down the street from our studio. We never are present. The idea is that we have enough attention on us. Let's now give attention to others, whether through curating, whether through creating a platform for others to do what we're interested in without this kind of oppressive emphasis on authorship, which is always like, we want you, Payam, we want you, Kasha, we want you, Stan, to do this, we want you, Patricia. No, it can be anybody as long as they're doing the work, essentially. That's all that matters, really.
But I think it's also a strategy, a working process, and not strategy in the bad meaning of the word, which is, for me, going along, you know, with a practice which is not trying to build a beautiful object, or which is not contributing to a certain acceleration of the circulation of unnecessary objects, and sometimes we would better say gadgets, for visual gadgets, which is quite, and again, I like it because it's very discreet. It's not, you don't pretend, it's not, but it's very visible, and with the passing of time, you see the difference. And probably, because I think we have to be precise with words, platform is really articulating very well with situations. Because you know what you were thinking, and you say you are neither Slavs nor Tatar, and here it's like an anecdote, but Tatar became quite famous and really very positive because of Rudolf Nureyev. He became the very famous and very welcome Parisian Tatar. But apart from that, it's still a charge of many depreciative notions. And again, back to that, it's also very exemplary of the moment we are living in, where the building up of situations is not necessarily, and even not possibly, coming from people who would identify as the locals, those who know. We are there, we know, it's our country, it's our history. So of course it depends, you have different situations, but I'm thinking about a book. The name of this man is very, very difficult to remember, but there is a book which came out in English, it will be translated to French, by subcontinent Bangladeshi worker in Dubai. And it's absolutely amazing. He describes the functioning seen from his perspective. And it's another view, it's another way of understanding what's happening in the region. So it seems to me that this very, we're living in a very complex moment. The world has never been simple, but it seems to me that due to acceleration of close to, let's say, many things. The situations are, when you want to be efficient, when you want to to be meaningful, you have to be precise, and situations are built up very, very Iketnung observations and articulation. And this has nothing to do with, you are from there, you know, in Beirut, I had so many discussions with Lebanese friends, and I know much better than them Dahiyeh. You know, because you have many, many people who are living in Beirut, they never crossed this kind of, it's not an imaginary, but it's not a physical line between North and Southern Beirut. And of course, if you want to understand a little bit what's happening these days, it's quite interesting to understand what happened and what's happening in Dahiyeh, which I will never accept that it's Hezbollah space, because when you go to Dahiyeh, of course, you have many Shia people who came from the south after the war, but you have also old families, and you know the history of Dahiyeh was before the war and before in the beginning of the century, a very mixed area. And I remember a very good exhibition by organized by Feu Lokman Sim, who has been assassinated 3 years ago, on the complexity of the region, the many different, the Armenian, the Christian, the Sunni, the Shia, living in the region. So I think it has nothing to do, and that's why I find very, very, first of all, stupid, but also very dangerous, this idea that you are not allowed to speak when you are not from. I mean, it's just, and it's coming more and more. And I think that in a way you are what you said, you didn't say deconstructing, you said tu as utilisé, c'est pas déconstruction, c'est désarticulation. You are disarticulating the notions, but also on a very practical level. You think and you do, which I think also a very interesting balance and meaningful one.
Maybe we end it there and take, I don't know, on that note, because I don't know how much time we have. Are there any questions?
You made a brief reference to something unfortunate happening to the museum in Nukus. Could you explain more?
The Savitsky collection. I mean, the Nukus collection is basically, for those who are familiar, as Catherine mentioned, is a collection of nonconformist art, avant-garde art, that was collected by Igor Savitsky, collected by a gentleman who was exiled or self-exiled to Uzbekistan at the time during Stalinist highest repressions, and he would tell all of his friends, just send me your works, I will protect them. And so he collected what happened to be, by the time the Soviet Union fell, all of a sudden in 1991, you had the second largest collection of avant-garde art in the world, not in Russia, but in Uzbekistan. And now the Russians have been trying to get this for many years, saying that it's ours. And of course, that's one reason it cannot travel, is because they're afraid that if it travels, there will be liens on it, saying, because a lot of the people who gave the works or loaned the works to Savitsky in the 30s, now the kids are saying, you know, oh, my father never signed you a proper, you know, that it's our work, we want it back, it's worth something. And it's a nightmare administratively, let's say, bureaucratically, but it's a fantastic collection of a lot of work of Uzbek artists, essentially Central Asian avant-garde artists of the 30s to 50s, essentially. And yes, that's what I know about the problem of the collection. I know that the director was changed a couple of years ago. Also, the famous long-term director, she was fired, and now there's a young Armenian director. But yeah, yeah, that's what I know.
And that's why, you know, I went into many articles, and after visiting this Uzbekistan exhibition at IMA, Institut du Monde Arabe, and I was very, very shocked by the absence of a label, at least giving the history of the museum, because you had some major works from the museum, but you know, like shown next to the collection of ethnic jewelry, which is also a good part of the collection, but and like it was in this works absolutely amazing, and there are works from the collection, but you had no label documenting. You are not supposed to enter. Of course, they won't tell you what you said. They can't write on the label, but you know, it was completely erased, which I find extremely preoccupying. But we know a little bit all the history of this exhibition, so we don't have to be so surprised or naive.
quick footnote. When I first had the pleasure of meeting you and reading your Mullah Nasruddin book, a year later I was in Abu Dhabi, and Wynton Marsalis came and gave a concert and gave an interview, and someone said, "What did you read growing up in Louisiana?" And he said, "My favorite book was Mullah Nasruddin." And it turned out there was a version of Mullah Nasruddin by Idris Shah, published in the US, which I, an American, had never heard of. So,
any other questions? Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Captain.